Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices. Our hostess for today's program is Teresa Miller, Executive Director for the Oklahoma Center for Poets and Writers at OSU Tulsa.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is Pulitzer Prize winning biographer David McCullough. How in the world did we get you to come on this program, sir?
Well, I'm back in Tulsa to see some friends and to give a talk and have a good time.
Well, we're certainly honored to have you here. I was reading about you and you went to school at Yale. While you're at Yale, you meet the novelist Thornton Wilder. Had you already decided you wanted to be a writer at that point, or did that have any influence on your decision?
Well, I was torn. I thought maybe I would be a painter, an artist, and I was always very interested in it, and I was pretty good at it. And as youngsters, you know, you tend to follow what you do well or what people tell you do well. But I also loved writing all the way from grade school on. And I think by the time I was perhaps a junior in college, I knew that I wanted to write. But I hardly dared say anything about it because I knew how much I had to learn. I wrote for the yearbook and I wrote for the college newspaper the way people in that stage of life do. But there's a big step between doing that and trying to do it professionally. So after I graduated, I went to New York to try and get a job, doing something where I would be required to write and work with good editors and so forth, because I knew I needed it. And I wound up on a new magazine called Sports Illustrated. I was hired as a trainee, and that's how I got started professionally.
You chose another writer, William Dean Howells, a quote from him to start the Johnstown flood, and it says something to the effect that we live in the moment. And I just wondered how that quote set the tone, not only for the Johnstown flood, but for your career as a writer.
Well, to go back to Thornton Wilder said something in an interview. First of all, he was a fellow at Davenport College. Yale was divided up into colleges. And as a fellow, he was there on the campus. And you could go and sit down with him in the dining hall and talk with him and have lunch with him. And that was thrilling for anybody that aspired to be a writer. And he was very popular at that point in his plays and his novels. And in an interview, he was asked, how do you get the ideas that you write your books about, or write your plays about? And he would say, I imagine a story I would like to read, or that I'd like to see performed on the stage. And if nobody's written that story, I write it so I can read it, or so I can see it performed on the stage. Well, I have been writing the books that I would like to read. I couldn't find a book about the Johnstown flood that I thought really answered a lot of questions that I had. And they were all disappointing. There weren't very many. And I remembered what Thornton Wilder had said, and I thought, you know, why don't you try and write the book about the Johnstown flood that you'd like to read? And I'm still doing that. I did it with the Adams book. I couldn't find anything about John Adams that I thought really was what I wanted to read, and it's totally enthralling work because you're exploring another time, which is much like exploring another country, another place, and every book is a journey for me. And I've never known much about any of the subjects that I undertook in my books. And I think if I had known all about them at the start, I wouldn't want to write the book, because that's why I'm writing the book, to find out about it.
The discovery process. Well, when you wrote the Johnstown flood, you actually had a full-time job, as you noted, so you had to work nights and weekends to get this book written. So it must have been very compelling for you to share this story, to want to share this story.
Well, it was, and I have a wonderful wife who was willing to make sure that I had time at night after we put the children to bed, so that I could go in and work, or on weekends. But I would come home from my job. I was an editor in New York, and I commuted out to White Plains by train, and we'd come home and feed the children, put them. It'd be 9 o'clock by the time I'd sit down to start to work, having put in a full, long day. But you know, at 11, you've had this experience, I'm sure, you're a writer. At 11 o'clock, I would be less tired than I was at 9 o'clock. There was something about doing this that what I really wanted to do. Not what somebody told me I had to do, or something I was doing because it paid the bills, but something I really wanted to do. It was exhilarating. And Rosalie would have to come in and turn out the light at 11 o'clock to get me to stop.
Well, this book has become an enduring bestseller, and I just wonder, what is it about this tragedy, this flood in 19th century Pennsylvania that speaks to us in 21st century? What is it that resonates with us still?
Well, if there's a moral to the story of the Johnstown flood, it's that it's dangerous, possibly even perilous, to assume that because people are in positions of responsibility that they're therefore behaving responsibly. And the Johnstown flood is not just an act of nature. It was the fallacy of human short-sightedness and the thought that, well, he's in that position, he's looking after this. The people that owned the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, which had the lake, which the dam held back, thought that the engineers knew what they were doing. The people down in the valley thought, well, if the likes of Carnegie and Frick and those high and powerful people from Pittsburgh own that place, then it's being well cared for. And in a way, everybody was responsible, and everybody was guilty because they hadn't fulfilled their responsibilities. Now, like a Greek tragedy, there's a warning. There are clear warnings. And every spring, people would say, you know, that old dam up in the mountains is going to break. And they go, ha, ha, ha. And then it did. And it was just terrible. It was the worst disaster in the history of the country up to that point. And not since then until September 11th. And it was just about the same number of people who were killed. The Galveston flood took more lives, but the Galveston flood was really an act of God, a storm off of the Gulf.
Your second book was The Great Bridge, which is about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. And it was an incredible engineering feat. How did you balance that technical information with the narrative? That had to be hard to do.
Well, I thought if I could make it clear to me so that I could understand it, and anybody could understand it, because I had no training in engineering or mathematics. When I finished the Johnstown flood, Johnstown flood is really a book about human short-sightedness. But we're not always fools. We're not always short-sighted. We're not always irresponsible. And right after the book was published, I had two publishers come to me. One wanted me to do the Chicago fire, and the other one wanted me to do San Francisco earthquake. I was being typecast as Bad News McCullough, and I was only about 32 years old. It's too soon for me to be typecast, and I really felt a need to write about human beings doing something right, of facing an overwhelming task with the odds entirely against them and succeeding, and what makes that happen. I was looking for a symbol of affirmation. And it took me quite a while to find one. And just by chance, with two friends having lunch one day in a restaurant in the Lower East Side in New York, they started talking about what the builders of the Brooklyn Bridge didn't know before they set out to undertake the job. And the minute they said it, I thought, that's it. Because I'd grown up in Pittsburgh where the Roeblings had their start. My wife and I lived on Brooklyn Heights, right down the street from where the Roeblings lived when we were first married. And I just connected. I just knew this is it. And it was exciting. The whole project was exciting for me. And you know, you can go to people and get them to explain to you what you don't know. And there's wonderful librarians. I always tell students, you know, don't just go to the library for the books, for the newspaper files and so forth. Remember that the librarians are in themselves a huge advantage to you. That they can show you how to find things. They can set you on the right path in your digging. And I've never found the work lonely in that respect, because you're always trying to find someone who can explain it to you. You're interviewing people. You're going to archives and libraries and working with the people who know those collections.
And then you wrote The Path Between the Seas about the building of the Panama Canal. So we have dams and bridges
Yes.
and canals. And what do these represent to us on a symbolic level? And what do they represent to you? Because I know you love landscapes, and it seems to me that...
Well, I think they represent, in the case of the Brooklyn Bridge and the Panama Canal, a very noble desire to create something lasting and of value to civilization, in both cases. And in both cases, they were done right by human beings who were not perfect, and all kinds of scoundrels and charlatans were involved in both those projects. But by and large, the good intent and the hard work and the variety of talents that were brought to bear were successful. And they're both still there. They were built right. The Panama Canal is working right now as you and I talk. Ships are going through there right now. Same canal, same locks, same everything. Opened in 1914, still runs perfectly. They did a spectacular job. And they brought it in for less than what they had figured it would cost.
Now that's incredible, isn't it? Can you believe that? In what ways do these early books foreshadow your work as a biographer?
Well, some wise historians said all history is biography, and in a way, that's true of these books. I was interested in the Roeblings more than I was interested in the bridge engineering. I was very interested in Ferdinand de Lesseps and Theodore Roosevelt and the people who figure so prominently in the Panama story. The bridge and the canal are metaphors for very intense human drama, and that's what I write about, it's the drama. And it was because I'd written about the Panama Canal that I got interested in Theodore Roosevelt and thought, you know, I'd like to write about his childhood, because how did this frightened, peculiar little boy, this sick little boy who wasn't expected to live, how did he turn out to be the emblem of American vitality at the turn of the century? What made that happen? And once I tried biography, then I sort of didn't let it go. I spent 20 years writing biography, but now I'm back writing some history now, so that's an appealing return.
We should mention that the name of the biography of Teddy Roosevelt is Mornings on Horseback, and you did focus on him as a young man. Have you been tempted at all to write another volume about him as an adult?
No, I never intended to do any more than that part of his life. It's a book about a metamorphosis. It's how did this funny little child turn into the man he was. So once he becomes the man he is, then I know the story stops. And it's not that he becomes president. That's not why I'm interested in him. I was interested in him because of the story in that period of his life. And many people who attain prominence or importance in national life or in world history had extremely interesting lives before they ever became prominent. And sometimes that's when you can know them best, because that's when they're writing the most candid letters, diary entries, and so forth.
Is that how you get to know someone like Teddy Roosevelt personally, is that you're able to read letters?
Yes.
Is that how you get a feel for him?
Bless their hearts, in those days they all wrote letters, they kept diaries. Writing a letter was part of life. You did it. If you were a youngster and you were away from your mother and father, you wrote them a letter. I mean, it was expected of you. And if those letters were well written and candid and filled with innermost feelings and thoughts, their value is enormous. Now, when I was writing the biography of John Adams, which is really a biography of Abigail, too, there are over 1,000 letters between John and Abigail Adams. And that's a biographer's goldmine. That's because they're pouring out their innermost feelings to each other. It's only being written for that person. And if they were writing something that wasn't quite candid or was sort of posturing or posing, the other one would know it immediately, and they wouldn't do that. Now, some of the people from that period, like Jefferson and Martha Washington, destroyed those letters because they didn't want anybody to know what transpired between husband and wife, or between daughter and father, or whatever. But the Adams didn't. They didn't. They saved everything.
Did you ever feel like you were an intruder in a very intimate relationship?
Well, sure. This is one of those jobs where you get to read other people's mail, and it's endlessly interesting.
You mentioned Abigail Adams. How would you describe her and this unique relationship she had with her husband? Because this is a wonderful account. The book is.
Well, he was one of the most brilliant figures of that brilliant time. He was probably the best read and the most deeply and widely read American of that day, more so even than Jefferson. And she had never gone to school, and she was homeschooled, as we would say, by her grandparents and her mother. And yet she was very widely read, but an intense reader, a close reader. And she was a great writer. She could have been a novelist. She could have been a correspondent, for example. Her descriptions of life in Paris when she first went over there. Imagine a young woman transplanted, as it were, from a little town in Massachusetts, about 4,000 people. Hardly ever had an overnight away from home. And her whole life is suddenly plunked down in the Paris of Louis XVI. And she's writing about it almost every day to her sisters. They needed to write. You know the old expression, working your thoughts out in paper. That's what letter writing was then. And unfortunately, we've lost that.
Oh, yes.
And future biographers and historians are going to have almost nothing to work with, unless email survives, which I don't. Some people tell me it will. Some people who seem to know these things tell me it won't. But all of us have had the experience of we're writing something and suddenly we have an insight or we have an idea that we never would have had if we weren't writing. And that's why the teaching writing and encouraging writing for students is so important. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of exercising the brain. That's what writing is. It's thinking. That's why it's so hard.
Do you think presidents today rely too much on speech writers?
Yes, I do, but it's very understandable since they couldn't possibly write all the speeches they give today. But it's very interesting. Ronald Reagan, for example, now some of his letters are coming to light, and they're revealing a very different man than how he was portrayed. They're really quite wonderful, thoughtful, very well expressed. Eisenhower was a great writer. Well, lots of them were. And now, of course, politicians are so fearful of what they put on paper. Nobody in public life keeps a diary anymore. It's a real shame.
So it's certainly going to have an impact on the biographies of the future, as you noted. Something interesting I was reading about when you were writing John Adams, you had initially thought of the book to be about Jefferson and Adams, and suddenly it became apparent to you that this needed to be the story of John Adams. Why was that?
Well, I had the idea of doing a dual biography. I thought if you could have both of these men on stage, so to speak, that you would see them, each of them, a little differently than otherwise. And my great concern was how can I keep glamorous, famous Jefferson with all his aura and his place in American life from constantly upstaging, overshadowing short, stout John Adams that nobody knows. And I saw it as a writing problem, to give them equal time. But once I got into the material, once I got into what these letters that are all still very much intact at the Massachusetts Historical Society, I realized this is a marvelous subject. He's like a character out of Dickens, and he tells you everything. Sometimes he tells you more than he should. And I realized this is my guy. This is my subject. And once I cleared that up in my head, I was off and running, and I felt very lucky in my subjects over the years, and sometimes you just sort of stumble on them. But the 7 years or whatever, 6.5, 7 years I spent on the Adams book was the most interesting passage in my writing life, because it was so rewarding as well as fascinating to go back into the 18th century, which I'd never set foot in. I'd never knew nothing about the 18th century, beyond what all of us sort of know. And to be reminded again of of how well they used the language then. It's humbling. You know, we all took courses in college or high school English where we had to read Samuel Johnson and Alexander Pope and all, and then to go and read them now and discover how marvelous they were. And it's humbling. You know, we haven't advanced all that much in 200 years. When you read the way they use this and the way they express themselves on paper.
Is it, you mentioned the research you did with John Adams' book and the Theodore Roosevelt book. Is it easier to write or harder to write about someone in more immediate history? You also got the Pulitzer Prize for your biography of Harry Truman.
Well, it's a little of each. If you're working with a president such as Harry Truman or a public figure of any kind in the 20th century, you have an overwhelming pool of material to draw from. Photographs, movies, television transcriptions, magazine articles, newspaper articles. And if it's a president, then there's the presidential library with all that material. And you have the recollections of people who are still alive, who knew him or worked with him or were in his cabinet. I interviewed over 100 people for the Truman book. If you go back into the 18th century, there are no photographs, no recordings of any voices. There are no movies, no journalism as we know it. Newspapers didn't really report events the way they do now or have since the 19th century. So you feel at first, you know, there's nothing much to work with. But what there is this wonderful body of first-person diaries, letters, memoirs, state papers and the like are also spectacular in how they use the language. And of course, it's an adventurous time, and you have the paintings. And paintings are often a better source of what people look like and color of their eyes and so forth than black and white photographs. So I've spent days in galleries in Europe and here just looking at people from this period that I've been writing about and writing about still.
As we go back and reread your biography of Roosevelt and of Truman and of John Adams, it's easy to see how different they were. Are there any surprising similarities in these men who came to be president?
Well, you could say that Roosevelt, and I hadn't really thought much about this, Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and John Adams were all short.
There we go.
They all wore glasses. None of them was photogenic by our terms. They were all avarice readers and writers. And I'd say that all three of them were men of exceptional courage. And it was the courage of their convictions. Harry Truman and John Adams were both farmers' sons. Harry Truman and Roosevelt and Adams all served their country in many ways before ever becoming president, and often in the most admirable ways, in war and in diplomacy and so forth. Harry Truman was a very bright man and had great common sense. As I think Voltaire said, common sense isn't common, and it's a valuable quantity when it's around. But John Adams was brilliant. John Adams was one of the brightest men we've ever had in high office. Harry Truman was a real politician, you know, a party politician. Came up through the Democratic machine in Missouri. Adams hated political parties. He thought political parties were going to be the downfall of the country, which was not uncommon among many people of that time. They thought that factions would develop and that would pull the country apart. So in those respects, they were very different men.
But they had a common denominator of courage.
Yes, and they were all three men, I'd say, were profound patriots, without any question. And there was more to them than met the eye. And I think that's one of the things that I find appealing about them as a writer. They weren't tall. They weren't obviously handsome. They weren't obviously conspicuous in a room. You know, when he walks in the room, we all know he's the great man. Well, you wouldn't have thought that of any of those four. And to me, their lives, not just their presidency, but their lives are what's interesting. You know, if you're writing a book about someone who lived to be nearly 90 years old, and he was only president for 4 years, obviously that 4 years is extremely important because he is president of the United States and at a point of real significance historically. But it's the rest of the life.
It makes it.
And Adams never, for example, Adams never saw life as a climb up a ladder. You know, that finally I'll reach the ultimate, I'll be president. Never saw life that way. He saw it as a journey, and that one thing comes after another. His son, John Quincy Adams, who also became president, went back and served in the House of Representatives after he had been president, and it was the most important part of his life. That was the truly heroic period of John Quincy Adams' life.
Well, it's been a delight talking with you. I should say and make this note that not only are you the figurative voice of history, the literal voice of history through your series that you do on public broadcasting. Thank you for being here,
Thank
Mr.
you very
McCullough,
much.
and thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.